Good afternoon. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to come and talk about my research. In spite of the temperature difference, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's nice to be back in a place where a millimeter of snow doesn't mean the whole city stops functioning, and that when you talk about hockey, you don't have to specify it's ice hockey you're talking about and not field hockey. I grew up in Edmonton, so this climate's not unfamiliar to me. And part of my goal in pursuing PhD studies was to contribute to the growth and the development of Canadian sociology and deepen our understandings of how Canada fits within the broader world. The material I will present today is focused on understanding the dynamics and challenges of using social surveys to measure social networks. Because of the methodological focus of this talk, and as I understand it in this position, I will only touch upon my broader substantive research interests in understanding how the organizational and broader institutional dynamics influence health, on how wider demographic changes are changing the social organization of religion. Incidentally, my dissertation research focused on the causes and consequences of the rise in popularity of megachurches in North America. And finally, on how race and ethnicity functions to create barriers to the economic attainment of minorities. Just a quick word about my quantitative expertise. It includes the following kinds of things. I also have extensive experience using a variety of data sets from Statistics Canada, as well as the US Census Bureau and the Centers for Disease Control. Let me also say that if you have clarification questions, please feel free to stop me and I'll address them. But if you could hold your larger questions for the end of the presentation, that would be great. So let's turn to the topic of social networks and health. This field exploded after the publication in 1979 by Lisa Berkman and Leonard Syme of this paper, Social Networks, Host Resistance and Mortality, a 9-year follow-up study of Alameda County residents. This widely cited paper showed that socially isolated individuals were 2.5 times more likely to die than those with extensive social networks, even when controls for smoking, alcohol consumption, age, obesity, and physical activity were added. In general, research has shown that having large numbers of supportive relationships has a positive influence on a person's health, on everything from increasing adherence to medical regimes, to promoting health-seeking behavior, to improving rates of smoking cessation and weight loss, survival from cardiovascular disease, and the ability to manage stress effectively. So the structure and the content of people's social relationships are important determinants of health. But there's a big problem in studying these connections, a sort of elephant in the room. The challenge, measurement. Measuring people's social networks is an extremely challenging business. Survey researchers commonly use questions called name generators and interpreters to create a list of a respondent's closest confidants and their characteristics. The U.S. General Social Survey employs a popular approach which asks respondents to report the names of all those people with whom they discussed important matters in the past 6 months. The respondent then provides a list of names. Following the name generator item, the GSS proceeds with a series of name interpreter questions which collects information on the characteristics of the people named. Now, usually the number of names that get interpreter questions is limited to 3 or 5 because these questions are time-consuming and often tedious for respondents. Imagine a person gives you 10 names and you have 10 interpreter questions. If you don't limit the number of interpreters, all of a sudden you've added 100 questions to your survey. While the use of name generator is a common method to collect information about respondent social networks, survey questions, particularly these long, complicated ones like name generators, can create problems. One well-documented source of bias comes from interviewer effects, that is, the tendency for answers to vary depending on the interview assigned to the case. One of the most prominent examples of this comes from this paper by Miller McPherson and his colleagues, where they discovered that from 1985, the core discussion networks, that is the number of people who reported that there is nobody that they can talk about important matters with, nearly tripled. This finding was met by skepticism with some and was later revealed in this paper to be an artifact of the data collection process. The major issue going on was that during the 2004 GSS data collection, several of the interviewers, knowing that for every name generated by respondents they'd be forced to ask another long series of questions, simply skipped this section and reported the respondent as having no close confidence. There is also some evidence that the design of the survey question in online or app-based delivery modes can bias results. One experimental study showed that the number of boxes available to enter names in on a web form impacts the number of names you generated. If you ask people a name generator question and then display 20 boxes on the screen, this serves as a cognitive clue to respondents, thinking that which suggests to them that you are wanting as many names as possible, which leads to larger estimates of overall network size. And finally, there's the problem of panel conditioning. Panel conditioning refers to the bias that emerges when respondents use their previous experience with questions on prior waves of the survey to alter their current response. While the existence of panel conditioning was noticed by Paul Lazarsfeld back in 1940, it's received very little attention in the research on survey methods. However, panel designs where the same respondent is interviewed at several time points are becoming increasingly popular methods for conducting social research. As response rates to phone surveys have plummeted, researchers have turned to recruiting representative samples from the population of interest, who then take multiple surveys at multiple time points. The degree to which panel conditioning is a problem with name generators and interpreters is unknown. There is some suspicion that respondents might remember that for every name they provide, this spawns this whole series of interpreter questions, and so this might make them more likely to give fewer names in subsequent surveys. However, this has largely been dismissed as a problem. Even on surveys where multiple name generators are employed, even on surveys where multiple name generators are employed. Say you have one asking about the organization a person belongs to, and then another about the friends a person has. There's only actually a small effect here. The second in a series of name generator questions. This tends to generate smaller numbers of networks smaller number of names if placed after another survey. But again, in general, this effect is seen to be small. Survey researchers usually operate under the assumption that survey memory is short. The common wisdom is that most respondents don't remember the first question on a survey they were asked by the time they get to the end of the survey. This is particularly true for mundane questions or small details about the format of surveys. In terms of name generators, no one really expects the repeated use of name generators to be subject to panel conditioning. So this has never been examined. But I will show to you that this is in fact not true. I will provide a demonstration that panel conditioning along with survey interviewer effects and survey design is a real problem. Let me describe the data I'm going to use to do this. It comes from the Duke Clergy Health Initiative. The Duke Clergy Health Initiative is a study involving all of the United Methodist clergy in North Carolina from 2008 on. I joined the Clergy Health Initiative in 2011 while I was doing my PhD work. Up until I joined this project, the project did not include any sociologists or anyone with social networks experience. I was brought on initially to analyze the social network data they collected. Specifically, I was tasked with looking at the longitudinal relationships between social networks and health. In focus groups and in qualitative interviews, clergy said repeatedly that they felt socially isolated. As caregivers, they were always giving support to their parishioners, but receiving very little in return. This was in spite of the fact that it appeared, through the social network data that had been collected, that clergy seemed to have a large network of support. But before I get ahead of myself, let me describe to you the Duke Clergy Health Initiative. Again, this is a study of the entire population of United Methodist clergy in 2008, and who have been followed now for 8 years. It includes any clergy who have retired or left the occupation since 2008, and it includes any newly added clergy to the state. Briefly, who are United Methodists? We don't have a lot of Methodists in Canada. Most Methodists were part of the merger of several large Protestant groups that created the United Church of Canada in 1925. But in the U.S., they're the second largest denomination, with 7.2 million members. They're a mainline, more liberal Protestant denomination. In North Carolina, there are 2,072 congregations, led by 1,453 clergy. This map shows the state of North Carolina. And these purple areas are what are called metropolitan statistical areas. So to be an MSA, you have to have one county with a population of more than 50,000 people. And then the Census Bureau then attaches all of the counties that they feel are tied in a significant economic and social way with the county of 50,000 people to create the MSA. This gives you a sense of where the population, where the population is concentrated in the state and where there are more rural areas. The yellow triangles are churches, where the triangles are scaled by the size of congregation. Churches are spread across rural and urban areas. Most churches are small and led by part-time clergy or clergy assigned to multiple congregations. Our survey also includes about 300 other people who either don't directly serve churches, are retired, or who have left the occupation. As I said, the survey began in 2008 and will continue through 2016 and has three major components. First, it includes a panel survey conducted every other year, the whole population. Secondly, the study involved a randomized controlled trial of a major health intervention aimed at reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. About 2/3 of the clergy participated in this intervention. We've just wrapped up follow-up interviews, and we're determining the long-term impact of our intervention, and it's also included several quantitative data collection efforts. Let me mention to you a few important characteristics of this survey that will help you understand our project a little better. The size of each wave is listed here. It's about 1,700 interviews per wave, with very good response rates. They've declined over time, as is common with panel surveys. One other thing to note is that in 2008, investigators implemented an experimental comparison of the web survey with the telephone survey. Because web-based surveys offer considerable savings, the project leaders wanted to see if we could go to an all web-based design. And after 2008, so from 2010 onwards, in fact, the survey went purely online with a mail-in option. There's about 1,400 participants across all three waves of the survey, and almost 1,300 across all four waves. So why are we studying the health of this particular population? Well, up until the Clergy Health Initiative, it was common wisdom that clergy were a healthy group. The fact that most were married, often had a spouse who stayed at home, had advanced degrees, and enjoyed relative social prestige and a broad range of social connections. These things were generally considered to be protective of health. But by the early 2000s, the denomination had begun noticing that health expenses for clergy were going way up. And so the Clergy Health Initiative was born. Some have been concerned that studying clergy in one southern state may create problems with generalizing to the population, but subsequent analyses have shown that these data are representative of all United Methodist clergy across the U.S. So what does the health of clergy in North Carolina look like? Well, this bar chart plots the prevalence of several important health conditions in our population of clergy in North Carolina. Those are the orange bars. And in the state population in purple, although I should say that the depression measure comes from national data available from the Center for Disease Control's National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, whereas the state level data is from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, also administered by the CDC. I should simply quickly say that I'm presenting these statistics with controls for race, gender, age, marital status, and education applied. To do this, I run regressions on both the clergy data and the state and the representative data, and control for potentially confounding factors. Now, these are all Poisson regressions with a binary outcome. The binary outcome is the prevalence of the condition of interest. Whether the outcome variable here is whether or not the condition of interest is present or not. Now you're probably saying, hey, I thought that you're supposed to use logistic regression for binary data. Well, the big problem with using logistic regression is that it produces these cumbersome things called odds ratios, which are often very hard to interpret. Poisson regression with a binary outcome, as long as you correct the standard errors using a sandwich estimator, produces direct estimates of the prevalence of various conditions. The reference levels here are all chosen to match the average respondent in our study. So a 45-year-old male who's married, has a college degree, and is white. The rates of depression in our study population, again with all these controls applied, is 9.5% as compared to about 2% in a comparative slice of the US population. Again, this comes from the NHANES study. This 2% might seem a little low, but the prevalence of depression is much higher in women and in people without a college degree. It's also much higher in online surveys, whereas the NHANES here is face-to-face. The rate of the rate of diabetes, mostly type 2 diabetes, is much higher. Again, almost twice as high at 8.3% compared to 4.7% in the state. Obesity rates, this defined as a BMI of greater than 30, is almost double the state average of 39.8%, is almost double the state average of 21.6%, and the percentage of clergy who when asked to rate their health, their overall health, about 10% of clergy rate their health as fair or poor, compared to 5.3% of the state population. So, this is a population with some major health challenges that this project set out to explore and understand and improve. From its inception, the Clergy Health Project has sought to understand the degree of social support clergy receive and how social support is related to health. There was also a desire to see if people with lots of supportive relationships might do better on the health intervention. So both qualitative and quantitative data were collected on respondents' social networks. To measure social support quantitatively, the study employed the 2008 US GSS Important Matters Name Generator. Again, the question is listed here. And respondents can report as many names as they like. If the respondent names less than 5 names, they're prompted if there's anyone else. On the web survey form, respondents can list up to 30 names of respondents. The respondents are then asked about the characteristics of the first 5 individuals named. They're asked things like, is name 1 a United Methodist? Are they a pastor? Are they a member of your church? We limit the number of name interpreters to the first 5 respondents named. As I began to analyze the social network data, I first ran a number of data quality checks, knowing that name generators and interpreters can be subject to several sources of survey error. And, lo and behold, what I found were some significant problems. First, I found strong evidence of interviewer effects. Previously, most of the information on interviewer effects has come from face-to-face surveys and hasn't been well explored in phone surveys. This figure plots the probability that a respondent gives fewer than 5 names to the interviewer. So we have the interviewer number along the y-axis. So this is interviewers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Each were assigned about 100 cases. 4 of the respondents were female. 4 of the interviewers were female, 2 were male. And along the bottom, we have the probability that a particular interviewer will have an interviewee with fewer than 5 people. If all of the interviewers are performing similarly, we shouldn't see a significant statistical difference between these folks. The lines here are confidence intervals, around the mean probability. Why confidence intervals? Well, behind these probabilities is a regression model that's controlling for both the gender and race of both the respondent and the interviewer to ensure that these effects that we see aren't due to the fact that the respondent and the interviewer might be a different race or gender from one another, something that's been shown in other places to be an issue. The model from this graph is also a hierarchical model, which helps correct for the possibility that one interviewer just got assigned a respondent pool with very different social networks, with a very different social network structure, and controls for the fact that some interviewers were assigned more cases than others. Because interviewers were randomly assigned to their respondents, and because I control for these things, I would expect the probabilities to be all the same, but they're not. So what do we see? Well, we see a couple of problems. First of all, the probability of interviewers 5 and 6 of having fewer than 5 confidants, it's almost 0. And the probability of interviewer 1 having fewer than 5 names is much, much higher than other interviewers. We can look at this same graph, except now for the case where an interviewer has exactly 5 names, where the interviewer generates a list of exactly 5 names. We see a similar thing. We see a consistent pattern as we did in the previous slide. Interviewers 5 and 6 are fairly likely, are more likely than other interviewers to have respondents with exactly 5 confidants, and interviewer 1 is very unlikely, has a very low probability of generating respondent networks with 5 confidants. These results suggest that interviewers 5 and 6, whenever they were faced with a respondent who gave less than 5 discussion partners, they prompted for additional names until they actually got 5 names. They also suggest that interviewer 1 was trying to limit the number of names reported to save time or effort on the survey. I was able to listen to some of the transcripts from interviewer 1 and 6, and indeed this turned out to be the case. Interviewer 1 wasn't prompting for additional names if they got fewer than 5 names, and interviewer 6 was frequently suggesting that they needed 5 names. And really, you just need to give us 5. He was frequently heard saying. Should also say that the survey was fielded by a large, reputable survey company. The 4 waves combined have cost almost $1 million. And in conversations with the survey company about data quality checks that they did, they typically said that when they listen to the transcripts of interviewee interactions, they're usually doing spot checks across a wide variety of questions to make sure that interviewers are generally doing what they're supposed to. They don't typically focus on one specific question. It's just too time consuming. What about the mode of survey delivery here? Did this affect the results? Well, our study was the first to apply a name generator in both an online and a phone condition where respondents were randomly assigned to each condition. So, did the web survey and the phone interviews turn up different results? Well, in short, yes. The mean network size for the telephone condition was 6.1 versus 10.4 for the web. The median was 5 for the phone interview and 8 for the online survey. The standard deviation of phone interviews was much smaller at 3.7 versus 7.1 in the online condition. The web survey was generating much larger and much more variable networks. Here's a picture of what respondents would see when they got the name generated question. The question's at the top, and then there's 30 boxes to enter names in below. Now, I can't say conclusively that the design of the web survey created these larger networks in the online condition, but I think it's playing a major role here. Giving people 30 boxes to fill in is sending a cognitive clue to respondents that they should give us as many names as possible. Now, we didn't test this by assigning people to different question designs, assigning some people to this 30 box versus some people to one at a time name generator. But I'm convinced that this question design lies behind our results. I'm planning on testing this experimentally with a subset of our respondents in the next wave of the survey. And finally, what about panel conditioning? Sorry, I just realized I missed a piece in my script. And I should say, at this point, I should make a few brief comments about how clergy compare to the rest of the population in terms of the number of, in terms of the size of the networks, of their confident networks. Here I present statistics from Clergy Health telephone survey and compare them to the 1998 United States General Social Survey, which was a face-to-face survey, but really these name generators, there's not good representative data from phone interviews, so we have to compare them to face-to-face interviews. But they should produce relatively similar results. You can see that the mean size of social networks among clergy is number of names given by clergy is 6.1 versus about 3 in the USGSS. The median is 5 versus 3, and the standard deviation is much higher in the Clergy Health Survey as well. So what's behind this? What's generating? What's behind some of this difference? Well, you can look at the difference in the size of kin versus non-kin networks. Kin is just referring to your spouse and all your your immediate relatives, your kids, your parents, that kind of thing. And you can see that clergy report on average 1.7 kin in the names that they give. The 98 USGSS gives 1.4, and the difference isn't significant. However, when you look at non-kin networks, you have about the Clergy Health Survey is generating about 4.7 names versus 1.4 names in the 1998 GSS. So clergy, because they have a job where they're interacting with people, a lot end up with more people that they talk to about important matters. And furthermore, to explore some of the reasons behind we also did some follow-up qualitative interviewing to better understand why we were getting these large networks. And we asked a sample of 12 clergy what they were thinking when they were filling out this name generator item. And here's a couple of things that they said. One said, when I saw this question, I put down all of the names of the people, I put down the names of all of the people in my lectionary group. A lectionary group is just a group of pastors that meet monthly to talk about sermon texts. Another said, well, if I happen to have a conversation about Jesus when I was in the checkout line at the grocery store, well, I put this down. The interviewer, was this person a stranger? Responded, yes. So there's definitely the name generator question here was, so obviously clergy were interpreting this name generator question very expansively, and not really providing us with a careful with a good read on who the people are that they're actually in meaningful long-term supportive relationships with. I lost my script to this part. Apologies. And finally, we move on to the topic of panel conditioning. As I said, the web survey, remember, the web survey is retaken by each respondent at every wave of the survey, every 2 years. I have my wrong script here. Dang it. All right, I'm actually going to stop and I'm just going to go back and redo this because my script is just a little bit messed up. So it's worth stopping here to also consider the size of networks that we uncovered with this population. It is much larger than what's been found in representative data. So here's the clergy health telephone data versus the 98 general social survey data. There isn't representative data collected online, nor is there good representative phone data, so I'm comparing face-to-face versus phone surveys here. What we find is that clergy networks are about twice as large and are much more variable due to the fact that, in part due to the fact that many clergy report very large networks, say of 20 or more people. So, why are these clergy networks so large? Well, we decided that we would go out and explore this topic by conducting some follow-up qualitative interviews. Well, so why are clergy networks so large? Well, the survey provides some clues, as do follow-up qualitative interviews. First of all, if we compare the number of people named that are kin, that is a spouse or immediate family member, versus non-kin, we see that clergy report similar numbers of kin connections, but they report much larger non-kin connections. The difference in kin relations is 1.7 to 1.4 is not significant. However, the non-kin relationships 4.7 to 1.4 is significant. This is probably simply because pastors interact with a lot of people. It's part of their jobs. So this result is not all that surprising. We also conducted phone interviews after the 2012, qualitative phone interviews after the 2012 survey with 10 of our respondents to find out what they were thinking when they answered this question. A couple of the responses here are informative. One pastor said, well, when I saw this question, I put down the names of all the people in my lectionary group. That's a group of people that meet monthly, group of pastors that meet monthly to talk about sermon texts. Another said, the respondent, if I happen to have a conversation about Jesus when I was in the checkout line at the store, hey, I put this name down. Interviewer, was this person a stranger? Respondent, yes. So our question was picking up a bunch of people that we actually weren't all that interested in. What we really wanted to measure was the relationships that people found to be socially supportive. Instead, we got a lot of relatively distant connections. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Thirdly, we come to the tricky subject of panel conditioning. As I said before, current wisdom is that panel conditioning isn't a major concern on questions that don't. Panel conditioning shouldn't be a major concern with name generators. It's been found that even having a previous name generator on the same survey doesn't seem to have a strong network suppressing effect. And given that these surveys are spaced 2 years apart, it seems unlikely that people would remember that they are only asked follow-up interpreter questions on the first 5 people named. However, this is exactly what we find. Let num given here denote the number of names a respondent gives. In 2000, number of names a respondent gives. And so what I'm going to report in this first row of the table is the number of names a person gives in 2010, given that they didn't provide the same number of friends in 2008. So 1,343 people change the number of names they give. And I should say this is excluding everyone who retires or moves away, because their social networks might change radically. So, again, 1,343 people change the number of names they give. It's about 86% of these respondents. And what percentage of these people change to reporting 5 names? 18% of people do. Comparison, the number who report 6 names is 10%, and the number who report 4 names is 9%. We can do a similar exercise for people who switch the number of names provided between 2012 and 2010. Again, a similar pattern here is emerging. About 90% of people switch the number of names they give. 16% switch into giving 5 names, whereas 11% and 8% report having 6 or 4 names, respectively. I should also note that the number of people who switched to reporting 5 names, all of them had reported larger networks in the previous survey wave. It's really hard to imagine this result happening purely through chance. You'd expect even probabilities of switching into different categories if there wasn't some sort of survey memory going on here. In our study, even after 2 years, respondents remembered that they are not asked to provide the characteristics of more than 5 of their discussion partners. And they seem much more likely to report only, and they are more likely to report, and they become more likely to report only 5. So, what did I learn from this exercise? Should we just give up trying to measure social networks with surveys? Well, I don't think so, but there are definitely some clear implications that stem from this study. First of all, for surveys with human interviewers, there needs to be a great deal of attention paid to training and supervising interviewers when they are asked to implement name generator and interpreted questions. For most survey questions, interviewer effects are found to be small. For name generator and interpreter questions, they are not. And so they need to be supervised carefully. Second, when designing web or app-based name generators and interpreters, names should be solicited one at a time to avoid respondents taking cognitive clues from the design of the survey. As more and more surveys move online, we have to think carefully about the visual design of questionnaires. For more complex questions, it definitely requires doing significant amounts of pre-testing with different question formats to see if the way they are presented might alter responses. And then on the issue of panel conditioning and what to do about it. Some respondents clearly remember the interpreter questions are limited to a certain number of names, and they use this information to change the number of names they give at subsequent waves. One alternative to help counter this effect is to ask respondents for the characteristics of every one of their discussion partners, rather than just limiting the name interpreter questions to a subset of discussants named. This will, especially for respondents who report lots of names, increase survey burden and could easily lead the respondents to report a much smaller list of names at subsequent waves. So I think we have to limit the number of names receiving name generators. But we should be explicit with our respondents. We should tell them that we want them to list their full list of names. I think this is the most effective way around this problem. So following a name generator item on a panel survey, this disclaimer should be added. While we only ask you to describe the characteristics of the first few names you provide, we care about how many people you feel connected to. Please list these people. That might not be the exact wording. I haven't checked the survey yet. All right. The presence of interviewer effects, questionnaire, design effects, and panel conditioning, mode effects, and not mode effects. Questionnaire, design effects, and panel conditioning made it very difficult to use the 2008 to 2012 data to examine the ways in which social relationships influence health. Also, the choice of question, in this case about with whom you talk to about important matters, wasn't tailored to our population, and actually elicited a set of people that we weren't all that interested in. Again, this points to the vital importance of pre-testing surveys, even on questions that have been pre-tested before. The unique characteristics of a specific survey population can easily create problems with bias. One great thing about being involved in a panel study is that we get to correct our mistakes. So for the 2014 survey, I redesigned the name generator questions, which we then fielded, and we received the data back this past summer. Well, what changes did I make? Well, I scrapped the important name generator question. Really what I'm interested in with clergy is whether what they tell us in qualitative interviews bears out in survey data. Again, when asked in focus group interviews about the barriers they face to mental and physical health, clergy frequently say that they feel socially isolated and have few people to turn to for support. They state they are continually giving support and don't receive much in return. Unlike other people who are involved in religious communities, clergy don't find their churches to be places where they receive a lot of support. They tell us that they can't really talk to parishioners about either their personal or their professional problems. They've been trained in their counseling classes that a caregiver can't share their more significant struggles with those they are caring for. And given that parishioners pay their salary out of their donations, clergy don't feel they can talk to parishioners about money problems or other professional concerns. So I wanted to test for the evidence of these dynamics at play within the survey quantitative data by asking clergy to state the number of people with whom they have shared important personal concerns. However, what happened when I pre-tested this question with 5 clergy in cognitive interviews, clergy said they really weren't sure how to define personal concerns. They said that, well, there were a group of people that they felt comfortable sharing professional concerns with, especially people. This would include people like their denominational officials, but that this wasn't necessarily the same group of people that they felt comfortable sharing their personal concerns with. So I then created these 2 questions, which ask separately about personal and professional networks. These interpreters are limited. Each of these interpreters is the interpretive questions are limited to the first 5 people named in each question. And there's also a statement included to say, hey, listen, we're interested in the overall number of people that you feel connected to, even though we might only ask about a select number in follow-up questions. I did pre-testing with 12 clergy where they were asked to fill out this name generator and interpreter, and then we asked them to tell us why they chose the people they did. From these interviews, it seemed that people were reporting the folks that they had shared personal or professional concerns with. And so here's a quick snapshot of what these data look like. There's 1,800 respondents in the survey again. They gave us the characteristics of 11,639 people that they had shared personal or professional problems with in the past 6 months. The mean network size was 6.5, which is still pretty high, especially when you consider that these names that clergy are reporting are people with whom they shared their own sort of personal or professional struggles with. 104 clergy reported that that there's nobody that they've talked to in the past 6 months. So, if you would have invited me to come give this talk in 3 months from now, I would be able to show you some results. But for now, all I can say is that, at least on the surface, it appears that the qualitative and quantitative data are pointing in different directions. So after this long methodological detour into the vagaries of measuring social networks with surveys, I'm excited to finally be able to start digging into the data to answer these substantive questions that I set out to explore in the first place. So I thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.